The most expensive mistakes are never made when people are unsure, they are made when everyone in the room is certain. The glass walls of the Langford Financial Tower reflected the morning skyline of Manhattan as sunlight poured through the executive summit room on the 53rd floor. Inside, a private investment board meeting was reaching its final stage. A $2.4 billion infrastructure acquisition deal sat open on the polished obsidian conference table, surrounded by neatly arranged legal documents, digital tablets, and confirmation signatures waiting for execution. At the head of the table sat Daniel Whitmore, a 42-year-old billionaire CEO known across the financial industry for his precision-driven decision-making and his reputation for closing deals without hesitation. His posture was still, controlled, and confident as he scanned the final summary page one last time. Every advisor in the room had already given approval. Every compliance check had been marked complete. Every risk flag had been cleared. The system was clean. The deal was ready. Around him, senior legal counsel and investment directors sat in quiet anticipation, aware that once Daniel Whitmore signed, the transaction would immediately reshape multiple international portfolios. Standing near the refreshment station at the far side of the room was Olivia Bennett. 27 years old, white skin, dressed in a simple service uniform that identified her role as part of the venue staff rather than the organization conducting the meeting. She moved quietly and efficiently, keeping her presence minimal, as she had learned to do in environments where decisions were made far above her assigned position. No one in the room expected her to be relevant to what was about to happen. Not even slightly. The final approval notification appeared on the central display screen. The room subtly shifted. Pens were lifted. Pages aligned. The final moment of execution had arrived. Daniel Whitmore reached for the pen placed beside the contract. At that exact moment, Olivia Bennett stepped forward from the edge of the room. Her movement was calm, deliberate, and unexpected. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She simply approached the edge of the conference table as Daniel's hand paused above the signature line. The room noticed her presence only after she was already within speaking distance. A senior executive frowned slightly. "Excuse me," he said, signaling for security awareness, but not yet alarm. Daniel did not look up immediately. His focus remained on the document. "Can I help you?" he asked without turning his head. Olivia's voice was quiet, steady, and clear enough to interrupt the final moment before execution. "Do not sign this." The entire room froze. Not metaphorically. Visibly. Pen stopped mid-air. A legal advisor lowered his tablet. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was disruption of expectation. Daniel slowly lifted his gaze from the contract and looked at her for the first time. His expression remained controlled, but there was a subtle shift in attention. "Repeat that," he said. Olivia did not step back. "Do not sign it," she said again. A senior legal director leaned forward slightly. "On what basis are you making that statement?" he asked sharply. Olivia did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the contract on the table, then pointed gently toward a section of the document without touching it. "That clause does not align with the regulatory disclosure structure referenced in the appendix," she said. A faint tension spread across the table. One of the legal analysts immediately pulled the document closer, scanning the referenced section. Daniel finally set the pen down slowly. Not because he agreed. But because the interruption had already altered the moment. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice calm but now fully engaged. Olivia hesitated only briefly. "I am part of the venue staff," she said. "But I reviewed the document earlier when I was clearing the room setup area." A few executives exchanged uncertain glances. That explanation should not have mattered. And yet it did. Because the section she pointed to was now being reviewed in real time by multiple legal professionals. The analyst's expression changed subtly as he reread the clause. "This is inconsistent," he said quietly. The room shifted again. "Daniel." looked from the analyst back to Olivia. For the first time, the certainty in the room was no longer absolute. It had become conditional. And in that conditional space, everything that followed would depend on whether the interruption was noise, or truth. The silence inside the 53rd floor executive summit room did not break immediately after Olivia Bennett's statement. Instead, it deepened into a structured pause, the kind that occurs when a high-confidence environment encounters information that does not originate from its expected hierarchy. Daniel Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table, his hand no longer hovering near the signature line. The pen rested on the document, untouched, as his attention shifted fully toward the disruption in front of him. Around the room, senior legal counsel and investment directors began re-engaging with the contract, their focus no longer on execution timing but on verification of what had just been introduced. The analyst who had first reacted to Olivia's observation continued scanning the clause she indicated. His expression gradually tightened as he cross-referenced the appendix references and regulatory disclosures embedded in the agreement. "This section does not align with the referenced compliance framework," he said quietly. A second legal advisor leaned closer to verify independently. "The language shifts liability distribution in a way that is not consistent with the supporting documentation," she confirmed. A subtle change passed through the room. Not alarm, but recalibration. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice steady but now more measured than before. "Explain the impact," he said. The senior legal director adjusted his tablet and reviewed the structured summary. "If executed as written," he said, "this clause introduces conditional liability transfer that activates post-settlement rather than pre-approval alignment." He paused briefly before continuing. "That would create exposure after execution that cannot be mitigated through standard reversal procedures." The words settled heavily across the table. Daniel leaned back slightly, his eyes moving from the document to Olivia. "This was not flagged in final review," he said. The legal director hesitated. "It appears to have been introduced during last stage consolidation," he replied. "It was likely absorbed into the final draft without isolated clause revalidation." Daniel's gaze returned to the document. The system had cleared it. The process had approved it. Every checkpoint had confirmed readiness. And yet, in less than a minute, that certainty had been disrupted by a voice from outside the validation structure. He turned slightly toward Olivia. "How did you identify this?" he asked. Olivia remained composed, her posture unchanged. "I was reviewing the printed draft during setup clearance," she said. "I noticed that the liability section did not match the regulatory sequence described in the appendix." A senior executive frowned. "You do not have legal training," he said carefully. Olivia did not respond defensively. "I am not part of your legal team," she said simply. That answer did not resolve the tension. It intensified it. Because the validity of the observation was no longer tied to role authority. It was tied to accuracy. Daniel looked at the analyst again. "Confirm scope of risk," he said. The analyst continued reviewing for several seconds before responding. "If this clause remains uncorrected, it introduces post-execution liability exposure that scales across all downstream asset distribution channels." The room went quiet again. Not from confusion. From clarity. Daniel placed both hands on the table, looking down at the contract as if seeing it for the first time in a different structural context. The certainty that had defined the moment before Olivia spoke was no longer intact. It had been replaced by conditional evaluation. "We were seconds away from executing this," he said quietly. No one contradicted him. Because the timeline confirmed it. He exhaled slowly, then looked back at Olivia. "If you had not spoken," he said, "this would have been signed." Olivia nodded once. "Yes," she said. A pause followed. Daniel's expression remained controlled, but his focus had shifted into something more analytical. "That means our validation process did not detect a structural inconsistency," he said. The legal director responded carefully. It appears the issue is not within a single review layer, he said. It is between layers. That distinction changed the tone of the room again. Daniel slowly turned his attention back to the table. The contract was still present. Still intact. But its meaning had shifted entirely. It was no longer an executable agreement. It was now an artifact of a system that had nearly validated an incomplete structure. And for the first time since the meeting began, the question was no longer whether the contract was ready. It was whether the system that approved it had ever been fully capable of seeing what was actually inside it. The atmosphere inside the 53rd floor executive summit room had shifted from execution certainty to structured reassessment, where every element of the contract was now being treated as a live system rather than a finalized agreement. The document that had been seconds away from being signed was now spread across multiple screens, dissected line by legal counsel and financial analysts attempting to reconstruct how a validated structure had failed to detect a critical inconsistency. Daniel Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table, his posture still controlled, but his focus now fully engaged in reinterpretation rather than approval. The pen that had been positioned for signature was no longer relevant. Across the room, Olivia Bennett stood in the same position she had occupied since the moment she spoke. She had not moved closer to the table again, nor had she attempted to justify or expand her observation. Her presence remained observational, unchanged by the shift in authority dynamics around her. A senior compliance officer entered the room with a printed risk summary generated from a rapid clause reanalysis. He placed it on the table and spoke immediately. "We have completed a full structural breakdown of the disputed clause," he said. "The issue is not isolated to liability distribution. It affects sequencing logic across settlement validation and post-execution reconciliation frameworks." Daniel took the report and scanned it quickly before responding. "Explain the consequence in operational terms," he said. The officer adjusted his stance slightly. "If executed, the agreement creates a delayed exposure condition," he said. "This means financial liability is not triggered at the moment of approval, but emerges after system settlement has already finalized downstream allocations." A pause followed as the implication settled into the room. This was no longer a drafting oversight. It was a timing mismatch embedded in structural logic. Daniel leaned forward slightly, placing the report back on the table. "So the system did not fail to detect risk," he said. "It failed to evaluate timing dependencies correctly." The compliance officer nodded. "Yes. The validation layers treated conditional sequencing as independent validation points rather than interdependent logic chains." Daniel turned his attention toward the legal team. "Why was this not identified during cross-review?" he asked. A senior legal advisor responded carefully. "Because each section was reviewed under isolated compliance criteria," she said. "The interaction between clauses was not modeled as a single dynamic system." That answer created a shift in the room. It redefined the issue from oversight to methodology limitation. Daniel remained silent for a moment, then slowly looked toward Olivia. "You identified an interaction failure without access to our modeling systems," he said. Olivia responded simply. "I compared what one section said with what the other section assumed." Daniel studied her carefully. "And you recognized inconsistency without formal training," he continued. Olivia nodded once. "I noticed they were describing different versions of the same process." A faint silence followed, heavier than before, because the explanation bypassed technical language entirely and went directly to structural observation. One of the senior analysts spoke quietly. "If this observation is correct, then our validation framework is not designed to detect interdependent clause behavior," he said. Daniel turned slightly toward him. "It is designed to confirm section accuracy independently," he corrected. The analyst nodded. "Which means systemic risk emerges only when sections interact under execution conditions." Daniel exhaled slowly, then looked down at the contract again. The document now felt different. Not incorrect in intent, but incomplete in structural modeling. He leaned back in his chair, processing the implication in silence. Around the room, engineers and legal professionals continued re-evaluating the agreement, now shifting from approval validation to dependency mapping across contractual layers. The realization was becoming increasingly clear. The system had not missed a single clause. It had missed how the clauses behaved together over time. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice lower but precise. "We almost executed a structure that had never been evaluated as a system," he said. No one contradicted him. Because the evidence supported the statement too clearly. He turned once more toward Olivia. "If you had not spoken," he said, "this interaction failure would have gone live." Olivia did not respond beyond a slight nod. "Yes," she said. A brief silence followed. Daniel's expression remained controlled, but his attention had shifted into deeper analysis. "This changes how we define validation," he said. The legal director responded immediately. "It requires integration of cross-clause interaction modeling," she said. Daniel shook his head slightly. "It requires recognition that validation without system-level interaction analysis is incomplete by design," he said. The room fell quiet again, not in disagreement, but in recalibration. The contract remained on the table, but its status had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a final agreement. It was now a case study in how structured approval systems could miss emergent behavior between validated components. And for the first time since the meeting began, the focus was no longer on signing or rejecting. It was on understanding how something fully approved at every layer could still fail when those layers interacted in ways no single review stage had been designed to observe. The 53rd floor executive summit room had fully transitioned into a deep structural evaluation state, where the original purpose of the meeting had been completely replaced by a comprehensive reassessment of system design assumptions embedded within the contract framework. The document that had once represented a finalized multi-billion-dollar agreement was now being treated as a live model of interdependent logic failure, with multiple teams actively reconstructing how independently validated components had combined into an untested system-level interaction. Daniel Whitmore remained seated at the head of the table, his attention no longer directed toward approval or rejection, but toward understanding the structural behavior of the system that had nearly executed without full interaction analysis. Across the room, Olivia Bennett remained in her original position near the edge of the executive space, her posture unchanged, her presence still calm and observational despite the complete shift in authority focus that had occurred since her interruption. A senior systems integration analyst approached the table carrying a consolidated interaction model generated from rapid clause dependency mapping. He placed it on the table and began speaking immediately. "We have reconstructed the full clause interaction network," he said. "The risk does not originate from any single provision. It emerges from recursive dependencies between settlement timing, liability activation, and post-execution reconciliation logic." Daniel accepted the model and reviewed it briefly before responding. "So the system does not fail at the point of validation," he said. "It fails at the point where validated components begin interacting dynamically." The analyst nodded. "Correct. Each component passed independent compliance checks, but the interaction layer was never formally modeled as a single system." A silence followed as the implications expanded across the room. This was no longer a contract review issue. It was a system design limitation. Daniel slowly turned his attention toward Olivia. "You identified a system interaction failure without access to dependency modeling tools," he said. Olivia replied calmly. "I did not model the system. I compared what each part assumed would remain constant." Daniel studied her carefully. "You are saying the failure was not hidden in complexity," he continued. "It was hidden in assumption consistency." Olivia nodded once. "Yes. When assumptions are shared but never tested together, they appear stable until they interact." One of the senior legal engineers spoke quietly from across the table. "That means our validation framework is inherently limited to isolated compliance verification," he said. Daniel turned toward him. It is limited to static evaluation of dynamic systems, he corrected. The engineer nodded in acknowledgement. The room fell into structured silence again as teams continued mapping interaction layers across the contract, now visualizing how timing dependencies and conditional triggers created emergent behavior that no single review stage had been designed to detect. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the reconstructed interaction network displayed on the central screen. The visualization showed cascading dependency chains that only became unstable when multiple validated components executed in sequence. He spoke slowly. "We did not miss a flaw," he said. "We missed the interaction environment in which no individual flaw exists until execution begins." No one contradicted him. Because the model confirmed it. A senior compliance director added cautiously. "This suggests that traditional validation processes assume linear causality," he said. Daniel responded without hesitation. "And real systems operate on nonlinear dependency emergence." A pause followed as the implications settled deeper into the room. Olivia remained still, observing the ongoing analysis without intervening further. Her role in the sequence had already been fully acknowledged by every layer of the discussion, even though she remained outside the formal structure of the organization. Daniel finally turned back toward her. "If you had not spoken," he said, "this interaction failure would have been executed as a valid system." Olivia did not respond beyond a slight nod. "Yes," she said. A long silence followed as engineers and legal teams continued documenting the expanded findings. The contract itself was no longer the focus. It had become a reference model for systemic evaluation. Failure in multi-layer validation environments. Daniel stood slowly from his seat and looked across the room. "This changes the definition of validation," he said. The legal director responded immediately. "It requires integration of system interaction modeling into all future approval frameworks," she said. Daniel shook his head slightly. "It requires recognition that validation without interaction awareness is incomplete by definition," he said. The room fell silent again, absorbing the shift in interpretation. The document on the table remained unchanged physically, but its meaning had been completely redefined. It was no longer an executable agreement. It was now evidence of how fully validated components could still produce undetected failure when combined under real operational conditions. And for the first time since the meeting began, every expert in the room understood that the problem was not a missing clause or an overlooked detail. It was the absence of a system capable of seeing what only emerges when everything validated is allowed to interact at once. The 53rd floor executive summit room had entered a stabilized analysis phase, where the immediate urgency of contract execution had been replaced entirely by structural system evaluation and long-range validation redesign considerations. The document that had triggered the interruption was now fully deconstructed across multiple analytical layers, with each clause mapped against dependency behavior models that revealed interaction patterns previously invisible under standard compliance review procedures. Daniel Whitmore remained standing near the center of the table, no longer engaged in approval logic, but in structural interpretation of how a fully validated system could still produce emergent failure at execution level. Across the room, Olivia Bennett remained in the same position she had occupied since the initial interruption, her presence still quiet and observational, unchanged by the increasing complexity of technical discussion surrounding her original warning. A senior risk architecture specialist entered the room carrying a consolidated system behavior report derived from extended simulation analysis of the contract's execution model. He placed it on the table and began speaking immediately. "We have completed full system-level execution simulation," he said. "The interaction between validated components produces nonlinear divergence once settlement conditions are triggered across all dependent financial channels." Daniel accepted the report and reviewed it briefly before responding. "So the system behaves differently at execution than it does at validation," he said. The specialist nodded. "Yes. Because validation isolates conditions, while execution activates interdependent behavior simultaneously across all layers." A pause followed as the implications settled throughout the room. This was no longer a theoretical concern. It was a structural limitation in how validation systems interpreted reality. Daniel slowly turned his attention toward Olivia. "You identified this behavior without simulation modeling access," he said. Olivia responded calmly. "I observed that each part assumed stability from the other parts, but none of them tested what would happen when all assumptions activated together." Daniel studied her carefully. "So the failure was not hidden in the data," he said. "It was hidden in the interaction of assumptions." Olivia nodded once. "Yes. Systems can appear correct when viewed in isolation, but still fail when combined." One of the senior legal engineers spoke from across the table. "This implies that our entire validation framework is structurally insufficient for real-world execution environments," he said. Daniel turned toward him. "It is sufficient for component accuracy," he corrected. "But not for system behavior under full activation." The engineer acknowledged the distinction. The room fell into extended silence as teams continued mapping execution phase behavior against validated preconditions, now revealing that multiple independently approved components created cascading interaction effects once combined in live environments. Daniel leaned forward slightly, reviewing the final system simulation overlay displayed on the central screen. The model showed clear divergence emerging only after full system activation, with no individual clause appearing problematic in isolation. He spoke quietly. "We built a process that confirms correctness at rest," he said, "but does not evaluate behavior in motion." No one disagreed. "Because the simulation results confirmed it." A senior compliance director added cautiously. "This suggests we need a new validation layer that operates at system interaction level before execution approval," he said. Daniel responded without hesitation. "It suggests that validation without execution simulation is incomplete by definition." A silence followed as that conclusion settled across the room. Olivia remained still, her presence unchanged, as engineers and legal teams continued documenting system-level findings that would require full restructuring of approval frameworks. Daniel finally stood upright and looked across the room again. "This is no longer a contract correction," he said. "It is a redesign of how we define system approval itself." The legal director responded immediately. "We will need to integrate full execution phase modeling into all future validation processes," she said. Daniel shook his head slightly. "We will need to redefine validation as incomplete unless it includes execution behavior," he said. The room remained silent, acknowledging the shift in understanding. The contract on the table was no longer relevant as an executable document. It had become a structural reference case demonstrating how fully validated systems could still fail when moved from isolated evaluation to integrated execution. And for the first time since the meeting began, every participant in the room understood that the real issue was not what had been missed, but that their entire definition of verification had been built on a model that never accounted for what systems become when they are no longer observed in parts, but allowed to operate as a whole. The 53rd floor executive summit room had fully transitioned into a long-horizon structural evaluation environment, where the contract was no longer being treated as a transactional agreement but as a reference model for system behavior under full execution conditions. The engineering and legal teams had moved beyond clause-level analysis and were now focusing on how validated components interacted when activated simultaneously across dependent operational systems. Multiple simulation outputs continued to stream across the central display, showing layered execution models that confirmed a consistent pattern of divergence emerging only when all contractual conditions were triggered together in real-time environments. Daniel Whitmore stood near the center of the room, no longer evaluating the contract as a decision point, but as a structural artifact revealing limitations in how validation frameworks were originally designed. Across the room, Olivia Bennett remained in the same position she had maintained since her initial intervention, her presence unchanged, still observational, and no longer the focus of immediate questioning, yet still central to the interpretive shift that had taken place in the room. A senior systems behavior analyst entered with a consolidated execution dependency report and placed it on the table. We have completed full cross-environment execution modeling, he said. The results confirm that system divergence occurs only under simultaneous activation of all dependent contractual conditions. Daniel reviewed the report briefly before responding. So individual validation does not reflect system execution reality, he said. The analyst nodded. Correct. Each component behaves within acceptable parameters independently, but combined execution produces emergent behavior that was not represented in any isolated validation stage. A silence followed as the implication became fully understood by everyone present. The issue was no longer about oversight. It was about the structural limitation of isolated validation methodology. Daniel slowly turned his attention toward Olivia. You identified emergent system behavior without access to execution modeling tools, he said. Olivia replied calmly. I observed that each part assumed stability from the others, but none of them accounted for what happens when all parts activate at the same time. Daniel studied her carefully. So the system failure exists only at the level of interaction under execution conditions, he said. Olivia nodded once. Yes. Systems can remain correct in isolation and still fail collectively. One of the senior legal engineers spoke from across the table. This suggests that our validation architecture does not simulate real-world activation conditions, he said. Daniel turned toward him. It does not, he confirmed. It simulates isolated correctness rather than integrated behavior. The engineer acknowledged the correction. The room fell into structured silence as teams continued reviewing expanded execution models, now mapping how conditional dependencies across multiple clauses created cascading behavioral effects once fully activated. Daniel leaned forward slightly, studying the simulation results displayed on the central screen. The visualization clearly showed that system instability did not appear during isolated evaluation stages but emerged only when all validated conditions were executed together in sequence. He spoke quietly. We have been validating systems as if they exist in isolation, he said. But real execution environments never operate in isolation. No one disagreed. Because the simulation data had already confirmed it. A senior compliance director added cautiously. This would require integration of full system activation modeling into all pre-execution validation frameworks, he said. Daniel responded without hesitation. It requires redefining validation as incomplete unless it includes full system activation behavior. A pause followed as the statement settled across the room. Olivia remained still, observing the ongoing analysis without participating further, as engineers and legal professionals continued documenting the structural implications of what had been discovered. Daniel finally stepped back from the table and looked across the room again. This is no longer a question of improving review processes, he said. It is a question of whether our entire validation philosophy has been based on incomplete system representation. The legal director responded immediately. We will need to restructure all approval frameworks to include execution phase modeling, she said. Daniel shook his head. Slightly. We will need to redefine approval itself as dependent on system behavior under full activation conditions, he said. The room remained silent, absorbing the shift in definition. The contract on the table was no longer relevant as a financial instrument. It had become a structural demonstration of how systems that appear fully validated in isolation can still produce unexpected outcomes when all components operate simultaneously. And for the first time since the meeting began, the realization was fully established that the issue was not a single oversight or missing check, but a fundamental limitation in how complex systems had been understood, validated, and approved at every level of decision-making. The 53rd floor executive summit room had reached a stabilized analytical state, where the contract was no longer treated as a live transaction but as a full-scale structural case study for system validation failure under multi-layer execution conditions. The engineering and legal teams were no longer focused on identifying individual clause inconsistencies. They were now analyzing the deeper architectural implication that independently validated components could still produce emergent system failure when activated simultaneously under real-world operational conditions. Across the central display wall, extended execution simulation models continued running in synchronized cycles, illustrating how conditional dependencies across multiple contractual layers created cascading behavioral outcomes that had not been visible during isolated review stages. Daniel Whitmore stood near the center of the room, his focus no longer on decision-making but on structural interpretation of system behavior under full activation. The contract on the table no longer represented a financial instrument. It represented a controlled demonstration of validation limitation across complex systems. Across the room, Olivia Bennett remained in the same position she had held since the beginning of the event sequence, her presence unchanged, still observational, and no longer actively engaged in the technical discussion, yet still central to the interpretive shift that had occurred across the entire room. A senior execution systems architect entered with a consolidated behavioral dependency report and placed it on the table. "We have completed full lifecycle activation modeling across all contractual components," he said. "The results confirm that system divergence does not occur during isolated validation phases. It emerges only when all validated components are activated simultaneously in execution environment conditions." Daniel reviewed the report briefly before responding. "So validation does not reflect operational reality," he said. The architect nodded. "Correct. Validation reflects static correctness, not dynamic system behavior under activation conditions." A silence followed as the implication fully settled across the room. The issue was no longer procedural. It was conceptual. Daniel slowly turned his attention toward Olivia. "You identified emergent system behavior without access to execution-level simulation frameworks," he said. Olivia replied calmly. "I observed that each part of the system assumed stability from the others, but none of them accounted for what happens when all assumptions are activated at the same time." Daniel studied her carefully. "So system failure exists only when independent assumptions interact under full execution," he said. Olivia nodded once. "Yes. Systems can pass every individual test and still fail when tested as a whole." One of the senior compliance engineers spoke from across the table. "This implies that our validation methodology is structurally incomplete for real-world execution environments," he said. Daniel turned toward him. "It is complete at component level," he corrected. "But incomplete at system activation level." The engineer acknowledged the correction. The room fell into extended silence as teams continued analyzing expanded execution models, now mapping how multiple validated contractual conditions interacted across time-dependent sequences to produce emergent divergence patterns. Daniel leaned forward slightly, reviewing the final aggregated system simulation displayed on the central screen. The visualization clearly demonstrated that system stability remained intact during isolated validation phases but broke down only when all contractual conditions were activated in coordinated execution flow. He spoke quietly. "We have been validating systems as if correctness is a property of individual components," he said. "But correctness is actually a property of system behavior over time under full activation." No one disagreed. Because the simulation data had already confirmed it. A senior legal director added cautiously. "This would require complete restructuring of all pre-execution validation frameworks to include full system activation modeling," he said. Daniel responded without hesitation. "It requires redefining validation as incomplete unless it includes full system behavioral activation." A pause followed as the statement settled across the room. Olivia remained still, observing the ongoing recalibration of interpretation models without further input, as engineers and legal professionals continued documenting the expanded implications of the discovery. Daniel finally stood upright and looked across the room again. "This is no longer about improving review systems," he said. "It is about recognizing that our entire validation philosophy has been based on observing systems in isolation rather than in motion." The legal director responded immediately. "We will need to integrate execution phase modeling into all approval processes moving forward," she said. Daniel shook his head slightly. We will need to define approval itself as dependent on system behavior under complete activation conditions, he said. The room remained silent, acknowledging the structural shift in understanding. The contract on the table was no longer relevant as an executable agreement. It had become a reference artifact demonstrating how fully validated components could still produce unforeseen outcomes when executed as a unified system. And for the first time since the meeting began, every expert in the room understood that the limitation was not in the data, not in the review process, but in the fundamental assumption that systems could ever be fully understood without observing what they become when nothing is left in isolation. The 53rd floor executive summit room had entered a final consolidation phase, where all technical teams were no longer performing live correction or active validation, but instead synthesizing a complete structural report on system behavior under full activation conditions. The contract that had initiated the entire sequence of interruption was now displayed across multiple layered analytical interfaces, no longer treated as an executable financial agreement but as a diagnostic artifact representing the limits of traditional validation methodology. Every clause had been mapped, every dependency traced, and every interaction modeled across simulated execution environments to understand how independently verified components could still generate emergent failure when combined under operational reality. Daniel Whitmore remained standing near the center of the room, his attention fully absorbed in the structural implications rather than the transactional outcome. The document no longer represented a decision point. It represented a failure case in system design philosophy. Across the room, Olivia Bennett remained in the same position she had maintained throughout the entire sequence, her presence unchanged, still observational and calm, no longer questioned but still central to every conclusion being drawn from the analysis. A senior systems integration director entered carrying the final aggregated execution stability report and placed it on the table. "We have completed full system convergence analysis," he said. All simulation layers confirm the same result. System instability is not caused by any individual component, but by synchronized activation of validated elements under real-world execution conditions. Daniel reviewed the report briefly before responding. "So the system is stable in isolation but unstable in motion," he said. The director nodded. "Correct. Stability exists only when components are evaluated separately. It collapses when they are executed as a unified system." A silence followed, deeper than previous ones, because the conclusion was no longer technical in isolation. It was philosophical in implication. Daniel slowly turned his attention toward Olivia. "You identified a system-level behavioral failure without access to multi-layer simulation architecture," he said. Olivia responded calmly. "I observed that each part of the system depended on assumptions made by other parts, but none of those assumptions were ever tested together under real conditions." Daniel studied her carefully. "So system correctness is conditional on isolation," he said. Olivia nodded once. "Yes. Systems can appear fully correct until they are no longer separated into parts." One of the senior compliance architects spoke from across the table. "This implies that our validation framework is structurally incapable of predicting real-world system behavior without full activation modeling," he said. Daniel turned toward him. "It is capable of confirming correctness," he corrected. "But not capable of confirming behavior under unified execution." The architect acknowledged the distinction. The room fell into extended analytical silence as teams finalized the last phase of simulation consolidation, now fully mapping how interaction dependencies across multiple validated layers created emergent instability patterns only visible under complete system activation. Daniel leaned forward slightly, reviewing the final convergence visualization displayed on the central screen. The model showed consistent stability during isolated validation phases, followed by cascading divergence once all components were activated simultaneously across integrated execution pathways. He spoke quietly. "We have been treating correctness as a static property," he said. "But correctness is not static. It is behavioral under time and interaction." No one disagreed. Because the simulation had already confirmed it across multiple layers of analysis. A senior legal systems engineer added cautiously. This requires a complete redesign of all approval structures to include full system activation modeling prior to execution authorization, he said. Daniel responded without hesitation. It requires redefining validation as incomplete unless it accounts for system behavior under unified activation conditions. A pause followed as the statement settled across the room. Olivia remained still, observing without further contribution, as engineers and legal professionals continued documenting the final structural implications of the discovery. Daniel finally stepped away from the central table and looked across the room again. This is no longer about improving oversight processes, he said. It is about recognizing that our entire validation philosophy has been built on observing systems in fragments rather than in full operational reality. The legal director responded immediately. We will need to integrate execution phase behavioral modeling into all future approval systems, she said. Daniel shook his head slightly. We will need to define approval itself as dependent on observed system behavior under complete activation, he said. The room remained silent, absorbing the full structural shift in understanding. The contract on the table was no longer relevant as a financial agreement. It had become a definitive demonstration of how fully validated components, when combined under real operational conditions, could produce outcomes that no isolated evaluation stage had ever been designed to detect. And for the first time since the beginning of the meeting, every expert present understood that the limitation was not in expertise, not in process, and not in data, but in the fundamental assumption that complex systems could ever be truly understood without observing what they become when nothing remains isolated during execution. The 53rd floor executive summit room had reached its final analytical closure state, where all active simulation, verification, and reconstruction processes had been completed and consolidated into a single executive-level structural report defining the limits of validation under full system activation conditions. The contract that had once represented a high-value financial agreement was no longer being treated as an actionable document, but as a permanent case study embedded within system architecture review protocols across multiple departments. Every clause, dependency, and interaction pathway had been fully mapped, confirming a consistent structural conclusion, that validation performed in isolation could not predict behavior emerging under unified execution. Daniel Whitmore stood near the center of the room, no longer engaged in any form of transactional decision-making, but instead observing the complete transformation of how the system itself was now being understood. The environment around him was quiet, with engineers and legal experts no longer actively debating the outcome, but instead finalizing documentation that would permanently alter future approval frameworks. Across the room, Olivia Bennett remained in her original position, her presence unchanged, no longer part of active discussion but still recognized as the initiating observer whose intervention had triggered the entire structural reassessment sequence. A senior executive systems authority entered carrying the final consolidated governance impact report and placed it on the table. We have completed full institutional impact analysis, he said. The conclusion is that this is not a contract failure. It is a validation architecture limitation at the system design level. Daniel accepted the report and reviewed it briefly before responding. So what we experienced was not an exception, he said. It was a predictable outcome of an incomplete framework. The authority nodded. Yes. The framework was never designed to evaluate system behavior under full activation conditions across interdependent components. A long silence followed as the implication settled across the room. This was no longer a technical correction. It was an institutional realization. Daniel slowly turned his attention toward Olivia. You identified a structural system limitation without access to any of our validation infrastructure, he said. Olivia responded calmly. I noticed that every part of the system assumed correctness from the other parts, but no one ever tested what would happen when all parts operated at the same time. Daniel studied her carefully. So the failure was not hidden inside the system, he said. It was hidden in how the system assumed separation. Olivia nodded once. Yes. Systems can be accurate in isolation and still fail when unified. One of the senior governance engineers spoke. From across the table. This means our entire approval methodology is fundamentally incomplete for real-world execution environments, he said. Daniel turned toward him. It is complete for structural validation, he corrected. But incomplete for behavioral activation. The engineer acknowledged the distinction. The room fell into extended silence as final documentation was completed, formalizing the realization that all prior validation models had been operating under a constraint that excluded full system interaction under execution conditions. Daniel leaned forward slightly, looking at the final convergence analysis displayed on the central system interface. The visualization confirmed once again that stability existed only when components were evaluated independently, and that instability emerged only when all validated components were activated together within a unified execution environment. He spoke quietly. We did not miss an error, he said. We missed the environment in which correctness stops being isolated. No one disagreed. Because the data had already validated the statement across every simulation layer. A senior compliance authority added cautiously. This will require restructuring all approval and validation frameworks across every operational division, he said. Daniel responded without hesitation. It requires redefining validation itself as incomplete unless it includes full system behavioral activation under real conditions. A pause followed as that statement settled fully across the room. Olivia remained still, her role in the sequence complete, observing as engineers and executives finalized the structural transformation of how systems would be evaluated moving forward. Daniel finally stepped away from the central table and looked across the entire room one last time. This is no longer about improving oversight, he said. It is about acknowledging that our definition of correctness was built on observing systems in fragments rather than in full motion. The legal authority responded immediately. We will implement full system activation modeling into all future approval processes, he said. Daniel shook his head slightly. We will define approval as dependent on observed system behavior under unified execution, he said. The room remained silent, fully absorbing the final structural shift. The contract on the table was no longer relevant in any operational sense. It had become a definitive artifact demonstrating how fully validated components could still produce unforeseen outcomes when executed as a complete system. And for the final time, every expert in the room understood that the limitation was not procedural, not technical, and not informational, but conceptual, rooted in the long-standing assumption that complex systems could ever be fully understood without observing what they become when nothing within them remains isolated during execution.